Welcome back to our in-person folks. I hope you enjoyed your lunch. I know there'll be a few folks walking back in. And welcome back to our live stream audience. Really been a tremendous morning, a lot of emotional discussions. I'm so pleased and I'm honored to be able to introduce our next speaker, Secretary of Agriculture, Tom Vilsack, and proud father of law alum, Doug Vilsack. Secretary Vilsack is the 32nd Secretary of Agriculture, and he was the 30th Secretary of Agriculture, serving 8 years under President Obama. A former governor of Iowa, he's worked hard to strengthen the American agricultural economy, build vibrant rural economies, and create new markets for innovation in rural America. He's fought for investments in rural infrastructure, renewable energy, and large-scale conservation partnerships. There's a couple of reasons why this man is one of the longer serving and more popular secretaries of agriculture, and it's because he's a really, really nice human being. I have a quick story to tell. I don't know if the secretary remembers this, but when I was majority leader and he was governor, this is very embarrassing, I collapsed on the House floor. I was fine, but it was a really slow news day and it made national news. So about 5 days later, I get a handwritten note, this beautiful seal from the governor of Iowa, and Secretary Vilsack wrote me, and he said he and his wife Christy were so sorry to hear about my spell. So if you're a Midwesterner, I'm sure that touches your heart. So that's exactly what my mom and would have said. She was sorry about my spell. And, you know, there's not a lot of people like that, particularly in politics, but he is a shining example. So please help me welcome Secretary Tom Vilsack.
Alice, thanks very, very much. And thanks, I appreciate the introduction, very, very kind, and really appreciate most of all the work that you have done. I think one of the reasons why I became very interested in environmental issues and natural resource issues was having met you and knowing of your passion and interest in it. You had made obviously an impact on Doug and a friendship that I think led to our friendship. And so certainly appreciate the opportunity to be here today and know that you're still continuing this work here at the law school. And I appreciate the opportunity to be down here again. The last time I was here, I think I spent a good deal of time talking about biochar. So maybe there'll be a question about that again for a continuation. And I appreciate everybody spending a few minutes this afternoon with me. I've been told I've got about 10 minutes to speak to you, and then the rest of the time is for questions. There's an awful lot I can say about what we're doing at the Department of Agriculture, especially as it relates to climate. So what I thought I would do is briefly go through kind of a structure of what we're doing with our climate action plan, talk a little bit about where we see the threats to U.S. agriculture, what we think we need to do to make a difference, talk a little bit about the values that are driving the work at the department, and then finish with a couple of comments about our efforts on equity. Because I know that that's an area of interest to this audience. First of all, I don't think it's any secret. I think we all recognize that we in the United States are becoming more and more acutely aware of the changing climate and the challenges it presents. And no part of the country has a better understanding of that, I suspect, than the folks out west. You all have dealt with a very serious drought in some areas of the West, a mega drought, one that's lasted for longer than a couple of months. In fact, now going on 2 or 3 years in some parts. In fact, today, 20% of the U.S., the continental U.S., is in a severe drought condition. We're seeing record temperatures. It's obviously an issue. And contrast that or compare that with the wildfire issues that you all deal with in Colorado and the West. For 69 days, we were at level 5 preparedness, which is the highest level of preparedness for wildfire activity. Now that's a record. And the reality is in many parts of the West, we saw the highest temperatures we've ever seen since they started recording temperatures in 1885 and some of the lowest precipitation rates. So obviously climate is an issue that we need to be concerned about. So we see basically 5 principal threats from a climate perspective as it relates to agriculture and forestry. Some of them are fairly obvious. Obviously, it's going to impact and affect productivity. Whether it's heat or disease or pollinator health or reduced forage or pests, they have a significant impact and effect on production. I'll just give you one brief example. I was in Oregon not too long ago on a specialty crop farm. Farmer was raising blackberries and had a pretty good crop, notwithstanding the drought that they were experiencing. But then the heat dome came and they had 115-degree temperatures for 2 days. In that 2-day period, he lost 60% of his blackberry crop in 2 days. So for him, climate, temperature is real. So that's an issue. Obviously, here in the West, and particularly in Colorado and the Colorado River Basin, water is an issue, both the quantity and in other parts of the country, the quality of water can be directly impacted and affected by climate, whether it's drought or whether it's cycle changes or whether it's the degrading of the quality of water. We're now seeing significant issues. And here in the Colorado River Basin, you're really confronted with a major challenge. The Colorado Water Plan, I think, probably summed it up best for this state. But I think you could have a similar calculation for each state in the West, which is that you're going to have to figure out, we are going to have to figure out with you, how to identify 1 million acre-foot of water, which is about 365 billion gallons of water, that you currently don't have, that you're going to need to have here in the state of Colorado if you want to continue to have agriculture and continue to grow your cities and towns. You don't want to be in a situation politically, I don't think, where you have to choose between those two, of agricultural production or urban growth. You want to be able to accommodate both. But that's going to require us to take a look at how we use water and what we do with water, how we can reuse water, how we can conserve it. And that means that we have to look at innovation and technology and figure out ways, at least in agriculture, for how we can continue to grow more with the same amount or less water. Not an easy challenge, but one that we have to meet. We also understand and appreciate that climate change can have a disproportionate impact on vulnerable communities, primarily because they are least prepared to deal with the consequences of a changing climate, and they don't have the resources necessarily to be able to adapt or mitigate to those consequences and impacts. So it's incumbent upon government to work to identify those communities and to provide the assistance and help to allow them to make adjustments. A lack of resiliency in our system. While this wasn't directly connected to climate, I think there is probably at least the argument that could be made that pandemics, to the extent that we've got zoonotic diseases that ultimately translate into human health issues, many of these diseases are a consequence of a changing climate. And I think in our pandemic, we have learned that the resilient food system we thought we had, far less resilient. Fragile, in fact, and in large part because of a variety of factors, not the least of which is that we have really focused in our food system for the last 30, 40 years on continued efficiency, continued productivity, where we have sacrificed the ability, diversity, and resiliency. And I think you're going to see over time a commitment to better balance that issue of productivity with resilience, so that we have a less fragile system when we have national disruptions, as we no doubt will, because of climate or because of future pandemics. And finally, the last threat is damage to public infrastructure. When I think of public infrastructure in the West, I think of the force. I mean, that is our public infrastructure. The Dixie Fire in California, that is now pretty much contained. Almost 1 million acres of forested areas destroyed, 1 million acres. So last night, Doug and I were trying to calculate how much is that? And it turns out it's about 80 square miles. 80 square miles destroyed in one fire. Over $500 million of expense. And there's no question that we are in this circumstance and will continue to be in this circumstance until as a country we get serious about forest management. And by serious, I mean we start putting the resources behind adequate management and hazardous fuel reduction to reduce the risk of these horrific fires. Until we start getting serious about it, we're going to continue to be dealing with the consequences of these fires, and we're going to continue to see communities like South Tahoe and the Culver Fire being threatened. So those are the challenges. Those are the risks. We want to build resiliency back into the system, and there at USDA we have a real significant focus on soil health. We are training literally thousands of our NRCS employees on soil health and regenerative practices. We want to see those incorporated in our decision-making and incorporated in decision-making on the ground. We have the 30 by 30 program where we're encouraging a reclamation and a conservation of 30% of our land and water. In the U.S., we have a CRP program that we want to see extended, and we want to see a climate focus. And we're making climate smart investments with our conservation resources. We want to increase the outreach and the adoption of climate smart agricultural practices by American agriculture. We yesterday announced the Climate Smart Partnership Initiative. Now, what this is a significant amount of money that we intend to invest at USDA with pilot projects and demonstration projects with the sole purpose of expanding opportunities to learn more about climate smart practices as it relates to commodity production, as it relates to specialty crop production, as it relates to organic production, as it relates to livestock and protein production. Why? Because the market wants it. You as consumers are beginning to demand to know more about where your food is coming from and how it's being produced and whether or not it's contributing to a changing climate or it's helping us deal with a changing climate. From these demonstration projects and pilots, we expect to accumulate a substantial amount of data that's going to allow us ultimately to set the standard for what a climate smart commodity actually is, just in the same way we currently set the standard for what an organic commodity is. That will provide the marketplace greater assurance, greater transparency, greater understanding of what it means so consumers can make informed choices. And it's not just domestically that this is important. It is very much an export imperative because our competitors globally have now understand this. They may have different paths and different routes to get to the same ultimate conclusion of a climate smart commodity, but they're going to market it such based on their system in Asia and Africa where there are growing market opportunities. We want to make sure that we remain competitive. We want to have broad access to data, and it's not just large sums of data, not big data. We want to be able to break it down to the local and regional level so that people at the local and regional level can make better and more informed decisions. We want to look for ways in which we can invest more resources in research and development, which is why we announced yesterday the establishment of a center of excellence in our ARS facilities, really focusing climate-related research. And we obviously want to leverage our climate hubs. These are locations across the country that have been for the last number of years analyzing the risk of climate to agriculture and forestry and beginning to identify ways in which growers and forest owners can adapt and mitigate to the consequence. What values drive this? Well, we want it to be comprehensive. We think it has to be voluntary and incentive-based, cost-effective. We want to leverage partnerships, and we want to make sure that it helps to create economic opportunity in rural communities, and we want to make sure that it is available to all. And let me finish with equity. Equity is an incredibly important aspect of this USDA. No secret here. The reality is USDA has a sordid history when it comes to equity issues. For many, many, many years in our past, we failed to provide access to all of our programs in a fair and reasonable way. And it created a significant gap between those who have been served and those who have been unserved. President Biden, very committed to trying to close that gap, signed an executive order requiring us to do an internal review of our programs at USDA with an equity lens to try to determine and figure out precisely how we can better serve the unserved and underserved. We've already begun that process. We've already begun it with tribes in particular through our Office of Tribal Relations. And we've identified a number of areas where we need to do a better job. One of those areas is indigenous foods. We have a great food assistance program, SNAP, But the reality is it doesn't recognize the cultural significance of indigenous foods, and it needs to. We need to figure out ways in which we can incorporate that opportunity, that option, if you will, in Indian country for those who are in need of food assistance. And we're also looking at ways in which key land holdings that the Forest Service has that might have particular significance to tribes historically and culturally, whether or not there's an opportunity for land transactions, land swaps, or land exchanges, or in some cases actually reverting the land back to the tribe to be able to create a better connection, if you will. While what is true of tribes is also true of African American farmers, ranchers, and producers, as well as Hispanic ranchers, farmers, ranchers, and producers. And so we're very much committed to this internal review, but we don't want to necessarily limit it to that. So we just recently, last week, announced the creation of an equity commission made up of experts, outside experts, who are also going to take a look, a critical look at the way in which we conduct business at USDA to hopefully make suggestions about how we may be a more equitable and fairer place to do business. Not going to necessarily be an easy task, but one that's necessary. I have spent more than 10 minutes, and I apologize for that, but let me stop there, and I'd be happy to try to respond to questions. Am I calling on the questions? So, yes, sir.
Secretary Vilsack, thank you so much for being here. We appreciate very much your visit. In Colorado, we have a problem that the 80% of the population is on the eastern slope. 80% of the precipitation falls on the western slope. We have many water diversion projects bringing the water from the western to the eastern slope, millions of acre feet per year. It's drying up the western slope, and obviously the Colorado River has historic lows getting worse with climate change. What should be the role of the Forest Service in adjudicating and determining how these projects should be managed? Because there are people that own water rights on the western slope and want to bring more of it over here in spite of these problems.
Well, so your question prompts me first and foremost to remind the admonition that I received from my son, which was, Dad, never get involved in water issues. They are really complicated. And having spent 4 years associated with Colorado State University, and as they are establishing a water center in part of their Spur campus in Denver, I've become acutely aware of how complicated this question that you just raised is. Here's what I think the Forest Service's responsibility is, and it may not be an adjudicate responsibility. I think that's frankly probably more state and states, plural, responsibility because of the compacts and agreements that you all have with the use of that water. I think that it is state policymakers that ultimately decide what the water transfer laws ought to be or should be or not to be. But here's what we should be doing at the Forest Service that we haven't done as good a job. These forests can be natural reservoirs or conservers of water if they are managed properly. But if they're not managed properly, then it creates a risk of huge forest fires, which in turn creates a significant impact on the capacity of these forests to conserve water. We have got to do a better job of forest management. And by better job, I don't mean just a little bit here, a little bit here, there. I mean billions of dollars better job. In the past, we have had maybe tens of millions, or in some cases, hundreds of millions of dollars going into forest management. But as soon as the fire year starts, and it's starting earlier and earlier each year, money gets diverted because we have to put the fire out. And we've never, ever adequately funded the fire service budget either. Just so you know, this is just really an important question. The people that are fighting these fires, I don't know how you feel about this, but I'll tell you, I was embarrassed by this. It turns out that many of the people fighting these fires were paid a maximum of $13 an hour. $13 an hour. And some of them, because they have to travel, were living out of their cars when they were fighting the fires. Now think about that, folks. Think about trying to attract people to do the job. Wanted. Somebody who put their life on the line every day in incredibly dangerous and unpredictable circumstances. Benefits, $13 an hour. Period. Living conditions, hope your car's got plenty of space. You can't do forest management or fighting fires on the cheap. You can't get all wound up as the nation does a couple weeks out of the year when we see what's happening in your world almost all year long, when CNN decides to focus on those raging fires and we go, oh my gosh, this is terrible, we got to do something. And then, September, October, November rolls around, not as many fires, we kind of forget about it. So, sir, to your question, we have got to put more resources into this, and significantly more resources. That's why what Congress is currently considering right now with the infrastructure bill and the reconciliation bill are so important, because for the first time that I'm aware of, they are really talking about real resources behind this, personnel and money. And I think if we did a better job, our forest would conserve water more effectively, and at least that would increase the capacity. And then whatever you all have to do from a policy perspective, statewide and regionally, to make sure that there's a fair allocation of that. That's obviously not easy decisions, but decisions that, frankly, as some of these agreements are set to expire in a couple of years, you're all going to have to take into consideration. So I don't see we have an adjudicatory responsibility, but I think we have a responsibility to help you manage the problem in a much more effective way. Anybody on this side? Oh, this is great. Oh. Hi.
Secretary Vilsack. My question is about a point that you raised, which is equity. And with conservation measures, I think on the municipal side, one of the key ways has been increasing rates, which really isn't equitable because people who use the most water can often afford to pay the most. On the agricultural side, do you see a way to ensure that these voluntary measures aren't essentially being forced on the small producers, and that the larger conglomerates and producers are also making their fair share of cuts and implementing these conservation measures as well?
Well, one of the reasons we wanted to start this partnership initiative with large-scale demonstration projects was the opportunity that it created for aggregation of smaller-sized operators to participate. What we envision is a university, a farm group, a nonprofit putting together a significant number of farmers and saying, we will pay you X number of dollars to instill and to insert and implement the following climate smart practices. We know what a climate smart practice is, but getting somebody to adopt it, especially when there's a cost associated with it, makes it incredibly difficult, because until you have a value-added proposition, or until you can have a qualification for an ecosystem market, carbon market or whatever, carbon benefit, there's no income side of this. So this partnership initiative is designed to allow aggregation, and then to provide that entity that's aggregating significant amount of money to in turn allow them to pay and compensate the farmers for implementing these practices, and working with a university or another entity to collect information, to aggregate that information, and then to provide it to the USDA so that we can take it from all of these different pilots and figure out, this works, this is how you would define a climate smart agricultural commodity. Then you say to the market, on behalf of farmers, if you market, if you General Mills, McDonald's, or whoever wants to be able to tell their customers that they are operating in a sustainable way and selling sustainably produced stuff, you got to meet this standard. And if you meet the standard, you need to be able to pay the producer an adequate amount so that they actually benefit financially. And that's the encouragement, as opposed to regulating them to do it. All right. The second piece of this is, as we're structuring this partnership, we're actually going to make a request for information here. I think it's filed today in the Federal Registry. We're going to solicit information from folks as to how they think we ought to set this up. We have a sense, but we want to continue to listen. the expectation is that as we apply this equity lens that we now apply to all of our programs, that we will figure out a creative way to make sure that a percentage or a portion of these resources are in fact utilized for underserved, historically underserved producers and for beginning farmers and for the folks who are least able to incur this expense. So I think with that provision, the aggregation provision, and reducing the cost associated with this, we should see participation at every level. And that's the goal here, because we have to have participation at every level for us to be confident in setting these standards. In the meantime, we're also going to make sure that our normal conservation programs have that same equity lens. So for example, we just recently announced a $50 million commitment at NRCS that's really focused on ensuring that these smallholders can participate in our conservation programs and making sure that we do the outreach necessary, that we connect to those that they trust, whether it's an historic Black college, a tribal college, Hispanic serving institution, or some other entity, a cooperative that they have faith and confidence in. We provide them the resources to get the technical assistance out there so that they encourage farmer participation. All right.
Mr. Secretary, we have a question back here from one of our law students.
Okay.
Hi, Secretary Vilsack. You've mentioned sustainable produce a few times, and that makes me think of something I've seen recently. I don't know if you've seen it. They're individually saran-wrapped sweet potatoes. And I was just kind of wondering if the USDA's climate smart standard for produce and food commodities is able and willing to do anything to reduce the ubiquity of plastics, well, non-compostable plastics in the food industry.
Well, I think the answer to that question is that we are looking at research projects that would enable us to have confidence in the storage of these commodities that ensure safety, safe handling, and ensure less spoilage. Now, I don't know if that plastic wrap is designed to address either one of those issues or both, but if that is, then obviously our research potentially could lead to a better way. I know that there is currently now some research on a spray that is being applied to specialty crops that essentially creates a seal that reduces the amount of spoilage over time, extends the life of that vegetable, which results in less food loss. And I didn't mention that, but should have. This is a major issue, frankly. If we're serious about climate, we ought to also be serious about not wasting the third of the food that's wasted in this country and the third of the food that's lost in developing countries globally. We got to get serious about this. The UN Food System Summit that just concluded last week, really, the United States is one of many nations entering into a coalition really committed to reducing food loss and waste, because that's the low-hanging fruit here. If we utilize that, then we'll obviously reduce the greenhouse gas impacts of agriculture and still be more productive. So I think the research that we're doing in this area, I don't know that our specific responsibilities or portfolios are specifically addressing that issue. It may very well find its way in the Food and Drug Administration, which has responsibility over everything but meat, poultry, and processed eggs in terms of food safety. So the FDA may have some say about this, and certainly the EPA would be involved in this as well.
First of all, thank you for coming here today, Mr. Secretary. I mean, you were a governor of a kind of purplish state, and obviously we're in one now. A lot of what you're talking about is kind of incentive-based work through financial incentives and different kinds of encouragement. But I think we all, the sort of there in the room that none of us can talk about is the fact that a lot of the stuff is eventually going to have to be mandate. I mean, I think we've seen with COVID, I mean, the fact that like you can incentivize all you want, you can give people millions of dollars in college scholarships, and people still won't sort of follow the science and the recommendations. And so I guess for you, on a state level, like at what point does, and Colorado is unique in that they have this plan out there, but do we have to just start making regulatory hard choices? Sorry, your golf course can't have a sixth fountain, those kinds of things.
Well, that's a great question, and I'll tell you why we start with incentives. EPA is currently considering waters of the U.S., a rule on navigable waters. And there are those who will really want the EPA to be very specific about what a navigable water is and very comprehensive about what a navigable water is. But the question is, how many EPA employees do you have? And how is it, even with drones and satellites and all of the technology that can cover wide landscape, how many people do you have to enforce that mandate? In other words, can it be an effective mandate? That's, I think, the $64,000 question first, is can you enforce it? Secondly, what I have found is that when you're trying to mandate the folks out in the countryside, they're going to do everything they possibly can to figure out a way around what you're telling them that they have to do. Conversely, what I have found is if there's money on the table, there's a higher acceptance level of this type of activity. Now, there are lots of other things that have to be mandated, right? We've got criminal laws and that kind of thing that absolutely have to be mandated. But this kind of thing, I honestly believe that we'll get more compliance, faster acceptance, and faster implementation if we got the incentives right. Now, the European Union feels a different way. They've got a different structure. They have more in line of what you have suggested. And I think I think we share the same goal. When you talk about greenhouse gas emissions, basically our goal in the U.S. is to get to zero emission agriculture by 2050 or sooner. That's the EU goal as well. Question is, how do you get there? The question is, do you only have one way that you can get there, or are there multiple paths to get to the same destination? I believe there are multiple paths. And I think you first and foremost have to start with an incentive base. And you know what? A good example of this is the Chesapeake Bay area, where there were some serious regulations put in place and not much. And then all of a sudden we came along and started asking, well, what if we incented this? What if we provided resources? What if we did this? And well, now we've seen pretty good progress in the Chesapeake Bay in terms of quality. So I want to give incentives a chance. And then if the incentives don't work, if you don't see acceptance, if you don't see significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, if you're not on track to get to net zero, if you're continue to contribute 10% of the nation's emissions while transportation and construction and electric power plants are converting, well, then maybe you're in a better position to say, guys, we gave you a chance here and you didn't respond. So we got to do this, because if we don't, we're going to have massive, massive adverse consequences to you and to the rest of us. And at that point, and I think, to a certain extent, I think we've seen that with reference to the pandemic, to the extent that it didn't work for incentives. You've got a number of companies and a number of government entities, and including the federal government now mandating mask wear. But it wasn't, we didn't start there. We evolved there. And I think that's kind of what I think. The question is, can we get there faster with this issue of climate through incentives? I believe we can. I want to give us a shot to do that. And we started, I think, pretty aggressively yesterday, and I believe we got very good reaction from both the environmental community and the agriculture community. So I'm optimistic and hopeful.
I think we have time for one more.
Mr. Secretary.
Well, I'll tell you what, we're going to take two more, because we got somebody over here in the corner that.
I would like the issue of subsidies and how they would relate to soil regeneration. how they do they conflict?
Well, it's a good question. Let me start by saying that when we talk about subsidies, I want to distinguish between, I want to know what you mean by this. Most of what we do today that falls in the category of subsidies is essentially payments made to farmers that recognize that there are things that they may not have control over that ultimately impact their bottom line. For example, a drought comes along and destroys the crop. And we've got a system essentially that doesn't make them whole, but keeps them in business. And the theory behind that is we don't want people leaving the land, we want people to stay on the land. However, in order to sort of qualify for many of these programs, there's a requirement that there be a conservation plan, that there be conservation compliance. So it's not as if there isn't some responsibility on the part of the landowner to take certain steps to embrace conservation. Now, what we've been asking for and how we've defined conservation is evolving. And I think what we're now beginning to evolve towards and move towards is a distinction between what I like to say, an extraction economy, where we simply extract, convert it someplace else into a higher value proposition, versus a circular economy where we essentially aren't extracting, we're constantly replacing, we're constantly regenerating, we're constantly giving back. And I think you're going to see more of that because now you're going to see a concerted effort on our part to help fund the transition and utilization of agricultural waste in a thoughtful, scientific way to reduce the greenhouse gas footprint of agriculture, to improve soil health, to improve water quality. I think you're going to begin to see us create that kind of lens to the support that we give. So I think we're evolving in that space. And I think we have to. I think we have to for the following reasons. One, because the market's going to demand it. And that really does drive a lot of decisions. You know, frankly, this is really an important question you ask. Because it allows me to talk a little bit about the part that the rest of us have played in this system that we have today. Because as Secretary of Agriculture, you hear a lot of people critical of farmers. Say, hey, these big guys, they're doing this and they're doing that. And I say to them, well, why do you think they're doing this? Why do you think there's been a focus on productivity? Why do you think there's been a focus on uniformity? Why do you think there's been a focus on controlled environments? Well, one big reason, because we wanted less expensive food, we meaning the consumers, and we wanted it to be able to be produced and prepared quickly. We wanted to be able to put it in a microwave. We wanted to be able to go to a drive-through and have someone, like I just had, hand me a bag with something in it that I could eat on the go. When you have that kind of demand coming from the market, coming from us, then it puts a premium on sameness. It puts a premium on productivity. It puts a premium on size. So we have the system we asked for. Now, we're changing, right? We're changing. People want to know where their food comes from. They want to know how it's produced. They like to have the notion that they're buying local. They like the notion to actually know the farmer they're buying from, which is why they go to a farmer's market. Our tastes, our attitude, our connection to food, and I think the pandemic has accelerated this, is changing the way we think. And we're sending a message. And now the farm community, if you look at the reaction yesterday to the partnership initiative, the farm community is going, okay, we got to get into this because our customers are demanding it. And then when you add to that the fact that customers not just here, but all over the world are anxious to see this, trust me, Asian customers, people in Asian countries, deeply concerned about climate. Most of them live on a coast. Most of them see rising sea levels. Most of them understand in a very real way their lives are impacted by climate. And their expectation is they don't want to use their precious resource to exacerbate the problem. They want to use their resources to help reduce the risk. So the export market, where we sell 20 to 30% of everything we grow in this country, sending a message. The last thing I would say is this. The second imperative is we got to do this because the market's asking for it. The second imperative is we got to do it because our soil needs it. Our soil health needs a little help. We're losing topsoil at an alarming rate. And that's the seed corn. You know, to use a phrase from my state, you can't lose the seed corn. You can't plant a crop. So we have to regenerate to reinstill and have a healthier soil. And that in turn will actually lead to healthier retention of water resources, which in turn will mean that you want to have quite as much water to grow the same amount. Well, that takes a little of the pressure off this dynamic between urban and suburban and rural use. So it's incredibly imperative that we continue to look for ways to encourage regenerative practices, and I think we're getting there. So yes, sir, I'll take your question.
Mr. Secretary, in getting the second bite at the apple, I was in Fort Collins yesterday, and you responded on forest health appropriately on scale and how big a deal it is. Our family has been in business for 140 years. We celebrated that this summer. And I live in a community that is many multi-generational ranches and farms. In the last week, 3 families that I never believed would leave have either sold out or put their places up for sale. And bankers don't care about climate, bankers care about payments. And I think you're going to have to think on a much bigger scale about how we respond. And your minority program for debt buy down is conceptually being challenged, but I think if you were to accelerate that process and think about it in terms of young farmers and sustainability and resilience, as well as minority issues, I think you would go a lot faster, and I think it's so appropriate.
Well, there's the reconciliation bill contains an amendment to the debt relief initiative that we have with our historically disadvantaged farmers. I'm going to answer your question, but let me just backtrack a little bit on the socially disadvantaged piece of this, because yes, it is being challenged, but I think what people have to understand is this. You're a farmer in the 1970s, 1960s, 1970s, 1980s. You're a black farmer in the South, Deep South. You're a white farmer in the Deep South. You live right next to each other. You got comparable sized operations. And you, the white farmer, go into the FSA office and you say, hey, Mac, I need X number of dollars to put my crop in the ground. No problem. Here you go. Here's the money. With the money, I go and I buy the seed, I buy the fertilizer, I buy the inputs, I put my crop in the ground right at the exact right time. Black farmer? Well, let me see a little more data. Gotta think about this a little bit more. A month goes by. Maybe 2 months goes by. And then the loan is denied or the loan is given. But by then, that growing season, it's already started. They plant late. Harvest comes, white farmer, bumper crop. Black farmer, not so much. What does that mean over a period of years? It means that white farmer continues to get an edge that grows over time. So when that neighbor's farm down the road comes for sale, that would allow either of those farms to expand, white farmer's got the cash, black farmer doesn't. So over time, this gap grew between those folks, between the folks who had full advantage of USDA and folks who didn't. So the question is, what do we do about that? And it's not easy to figure out what to do about it, but something has to be done about it. And so we're trying. To your point, though, there are also distressed farmers who are beginning farmers, veteran farmers, and maybe even some farmers that have been in business for a while, but they've got, a difficult farm, or they've got land that's not as rich as some other, they just have challenges. So in the reconciliation bill, there is a provision that would allow for an expansion of the debt relief to many of those distressed farmers as well. in fairness. So maybe that's a response. Maybe that's one response to your question of expanding the universe of people getting help. That's being considered, and if the reconciliation bill passes, we'll be in a position to implement that relief to tens of thousands of farmers, Black, white, Hispanic, Native American. And I think that's a good thing because we're going to keep them on the land. The second thing is that the American Rescue Plan also contained a provision that looked at how we might be able to help not just socially disadvantaged producers, but also beginning farmers, veterans, folks who are just getting started in the business, to your point. And they need three things. They need expanded technical assistance because the system today is complicated. Applying for these various programs is not necessarily a simple process. There's a lot of paperwork involved. And, maybe we need to do something about that. But in the meantime, there's a lot of paperwork involved, a lot of complexity, and it can be discouraging to people who don't know how to play the game. So they play the game, they don't play it very well, they get denied, and they begin to think that they're being discriminated against. So we need technical assistance by people who know how to play the game that helps those folks fill out the forms right, so that they get the relief and the help and assistance and the conservation programs and so forth they need. Second thing they need is market access. When we went to this productivity large-scale model, we create fairly simple market access for those large-scale guys. But these smaller guys, they can't necessarily always compete effectively in that game. They may not have the uniformity, they may not have the yields, there just may be 1,000 reasons why they aren't going to be able to compete. So they need their own game. They need the local and regional game, the ability to sell more locally, the ability to negotiate a price potentially rather than having to be satisfied with what somebody in Chicago decides your crop is worth on a particular day. So that's why we're investing in farm to school, we're investing in local and regional food systems, we're investing in expanded farmers markets, we're investing in ways in which we can create the supply chain locally that creates opportunities for them. And we need to do more of that, and this bill basically provides us some resource to expand market access. And then finally, they need land, right? You can't grow unless you have land. And that's not a simple thing. But what we hope to be able to do is to go to people who own land, not you in your family that's farming the land, but maybe somebody like me who owns a farm in Iowa. I don't farm it. A farmer farms it. But maybe there's an opportunity for me in that land to get slightly less rent. And maybe there's an opportunity for USDA to provide a nonprofit entity to essentially rent the land from me at a lower rate of rent, and then receive a bit of a subsidy, if you will, from the government, which in turn would allow that entity that now has rights to that land for a year, 2 or 5 years, to be able to lease it out to a beginning farmer at a rental rate that beginning farmer can actually handle. Instead of that guy or gal having to search or having to pay the highest rental value in the community at a time when rental values are really high. So we're trying to look at creative ways to deal with technical assistance, market access, and land. And hopefully we will find some pathways here that can then be incorporated in more permanent programs when the Farm Bill gets reauthorized in a few years. All right.
Thank you so much, Mr. Secretary.
Go ahead. No, he's got a problem.
One last. Yet contemplated how profound in the West climate is. That's what I'm saying to you. It is deeper than we think. And I think our response has to be deeper than we've yet planned for.
Well, take a look at the reconciliation bill and the infrastructure bill, because there's some historically high levels of investment for that very reason. I don't know that I necessarily have as intimate knowledge as you have, because I don't live here and I'm not living on the land. So in that sense, I think you're right, but I do not discount the fact that myself and many others who are in positions of authority don't fully understand the problem. Well, I think we do. I think we do, which is why we're pressing Congress to make sure that they give us the resources and the personnel to be able to address the problem as aggressively. We should have been doing this a long time ago, but it's taken a while, frankly, and with all due respect, it has taken a long while for producers to understand the severity of this. And here's an example. When I was secretary before, I had our team do a survey. Now, this was just Midwestern farmers, different group. And in this survey, we said, this was, I don't know, maybe 2009, 2010, said, do you want more information about climate change? Would you like to learn more about the impacts of climate change? Would you be interested in that? 80% said no, not interested. 80%, 5,000 people responded to this survey. 80% of them said, absolutely not. It's political. It's nonsense. We didn't cause it. Don't care about it. Nothing I could do about it. 6 questions later, we said, would you like to have some information about weather variability? 80% said, yeah, yeah, interested in that. Tell me more about that. Now, I understand there's a difference between weather and climate, but not in that context. So I think we've all been slow to recognize it. But this year, with the pandemic and the fires and the drought, I think the awareness level has risen significantly, which is why there are at least some in Congress and the president who are pushing a significant investment. Now, whether we get it or not, still uncertain, but there's no doubt it's needed, and there's no doubt that people understand, many of us understand it is absolutely needed yesterday, and we hope we get it. All right. All right, thank you very much.